Hello, and welcome back to another session of reviewing some of the work I've come across based off of the organic weapon design tutorial that I posted a couple months ago now. And this work here is by a Gino Fei, whose link I will include at the bottom here, so you can check out some of his site. He's got a few other weapons and stuff. It's pretty cool. And I just had a quick conversation with him and asked if it'd be okay if I could kind of do some more like paint over feedback in these, and got some more context from him as far as like what his goals were and what he was planning to do with these weapons. And yeah, so I'll kind of go through that with that sort of a lens. And based off of the conversation I had with him, I got a little bit more context for what he was planning to do with these and what he was sort of like inspired by and referencing when he was doing this. I have his reference right here that we'll be taking a look at and referencing throughout the feedback session. But from the initial get-go, his goal was to have these be themed in the universe of Valorant, kind of inspired by the Ion skin line that came out a little while ago. So I've also got these guys up here too, so we can kind of look through them. These are just concepts from Valorant that have already been released. You can find these online. And yeah, so we'll just be kind of going through them, and I'll briefly kind of run down what he's doing good generally with all of them. And then I'll kind of go into these and break down some of the visuals that he'll want to keep in mind if he's wanting to do things with that line, or things that were important with that particular skin line that come through quite clearly, I think. So first off, I think he's using his reference he's kind of gathered here quite well. And you can kind of see it, especially images like this here. You can definitely feel it kind of coming through in a few of these here. And also, so like, especially like in this one, like here. And there's a lot of sort of like nice echoing organic shapes that you have throughout a lot of these designs, which is kind of nice to see. So I think he's been, it's quite successful in that regard as far as like how that's being executed, and along with sort of a nice breakup of light and dark materials balanced quite nicely throughout all of these. And when we take a look at the other concepts for the Ion line, you'll kind of see that comes across quite a bit. So because these are being intended for like a first person game like Valorant, that there's going to be a few things we want to consider as we kind of like go through reviewing these, and I'll kind of bring them up here and there with a few of which ones are working really nicely with that. And that'll be things like, say, for like Valorant in particular, or I guess any first person shooter type game, is like the first person view of like here for like what the viewer is going to be seeing, if this is an eye, is going to be like super important. So you want to have like interesting stuff happening like here, and here, and all that kind of stuff. So that'll be one thing. And the other is going to be animation considerations. So I'm going to assume that based off of just like looking at this, that this is based off of the classic pistol, or just like a regular sort of base handgun. That's my assumption when I'm looking at it. So based on that in mind, that there'll be some certain things we'll want to consider, that especially when it comes to Valorant, that they have sort of an upgrade system, especially for higher tier weapons, that you could replace, say, like the ammo may not necessarily be like a magazine that kind of goes in the bottom or something. It could be like maybe you replace like a battery pack, or the top pops open. But despite having that, you're always going to have, for the first sort of tier of the weapon, you always have to have that magazine and that base animation that a player is used to seeing be there with the weapon, so that if someone decides to not upgrade their gun, that it's still going to be functionally, visibly interesting and still like have the same sort of working parts. So with that in mind, we want to say, like, when I'm looking at these, something I think for some of them it could be considered, it could work. It's like, if we look at the pistol here, let me just bring it back on the screen, that we have like this top piece here, and that's going to be like, it's going to slide back. You've got sort of like, these are like interactable moving bits I'm mostly thinking of. So like this top part will slide back, and the magazine's got to come out, and the hammer goes up and down, and the trigger gets pulled. And I guess you could also like say, you could include sometimes remove these or whatnot, but the ejection port is also going to be a potential thing to consider. And say on this gun here, because it's so small, and it's just because it's so small that you actually see the ejection port will kind of creep across on the other side and be visible from the top. Now, with that being mentioned, these are sci-fi guns, and you don't always need to have ejection ports or whatever. So things like that can be sort of edited out, but obvious things are going to be like, you've got to have a trigger, hammers are going to be important to have, and obvious place where like where the gun or the bullets come out of. All right. So, and I think generally he does a pretty good job with that. So I think, yeah, let's just go on discussing some of the stuff with the ion skin lines. Sorry, getting mixed up with the code name for it. So in production of this, or I think it's pretty obvious when you're looking at it, that this sort of skin line is heavily influenced from the movie Oblivion, where like if you look at sort of the pod ship or whatever it's called, that like a lot of sort of the design languages are kind of coming through this. We've obviously made some changes, but that sort of like clean minimalist aesthetic is something that was like really a big thing with this sort of weapon line. So as it kind of like moves through some of these images, you can kind of, or even like some of these shapes here, right? So very sort of clean industrial shapes, this contrast between materials of white covering with sort of darker undertech and exposed functional bits, and even sort of like matter coverings in some areas. So you get a nice sort of contrast between the two. All right, let's put that off to the side. So shapes are all going to be clean, sleek, futuristic. So you get a lot of like this stuff here happening, echoing of shapes, a bit of like a rounded slope to the front of it a touch. And this is something that's like prevalent throughout the entire line. And that's going to give it that sort of, if I bring up the reference here again, almost like an Apple phone or like, sorry, iPhone kind of vibe of like sleek industrial design. So very crisp. All right. And obviously, as I mentioned before, like the very minimalist color scheme of like blacks, whites, along with some transparent material. And in the game, these are used to effect of them being like, they will be sort of covered with the white matte material, or yeah, I guess it's matte material. And then like at a certain, or shiny, sorry. And then when it's like fully upgraded, there's like a transition state where it actually will become transparent or kind of glass-like. And you'll be able to see some of the functional sci-fi bits on the inside. And as a aesthetical thing for all the entire line, they all feature this sort of, here's a good one, like the energy orb in here to kind of like really push that sci-fi-ness with the little kind of arms spinning around inside and holding on to it. So yeah, you get this nice sort of balance of white sort of protective covering, rubbers for like interactable bits and areas where the hands are going to be kind of manipulating and kind of controlling things. And also like darker materials for some of the interior bits if we look at the call out here for the energy catalyst holder. And also like a bunch of sort of just clean, sharp sort of emissives that you see throughout. So all these like little blue lights and stuff like that. As I've sort of mentioned in other videos, that this is the sort of stuff that's like easy wins that you can kind of add into something to make it feel kind of sci-fi and interesting and engage a player that way. Okay. So let's start going through these. I think for convenience sake, I'm going to label these as like 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know if this is the order that he went through them, but we'll just kind of go through them in that particular order. All right, so starting with this first one here. So we can do a nice new layer here. All right, so I think like overall with this particular one here, the shape language is pretty interesting. There's lots of like rounded forms kind of going on, which is quite nice. And I think this is working quite well overall with this gun. There's a few areas where it gets a little bit maybe too angly, like in here. So just maybe like rounding out some of these edges could possibly help a little bit. And you'll see it starts to like fall in line with the sort of the aesthetics of the weapon where there's like these nice sort of beveled rounded edges kind of conforming to the shape and making it feel like a little bit softer. Front here is a little bit like potentially too detailed with a lot of like just like micro shape changes and plane changes. So maybe just simplifying this a little bit could really sort of help. Maybe even kind of pulling this back a little, or if this is like kind of holding it, give it like it feels like there's a physical sort of form wrapping around it potentially, or even just having this kind of come straight down and pop out could be kind of interesting here. But I think sort of emphasizing that this shape is being encased by this white form is going to be important. So having it be maybe like this would be good. And then it's kind of inside of it a little bit, right? So kind of watching out for some of those little micro forms and micro kind of like plane changes is going to be important, I think, with this kind of stuff. So definitely a little bit of simplification there is going to help. Okay. And also be careful of like a lot of the stepping that you have going on in the midsection here above the trigger and going back. It creates like this like chuck, 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 chuck. It's a little bit like too much happening there. So maybe like simplifying and massing these shapes up is really going to help with the reads on these things. And just overall make this feel a little bit nicer. See, that's already starting to help quite a bit. Okay. Yeah, I'd say like, so for the handle, maybe reducing some of these details here might be kind of good because you got like quite a few of them in there. Things like that might be a little bit kind of too small, might be like this little, maybe there's like a firing switch or something here. Maybe kind of beef it up, or actually maybe even want to like give it some more room here. But like making it sort of bigger, or replacing this potentially with where that would be. So maybe something in there would work. It kind of echoes that sort of form, right? So makes it feel like it's working in conjunction with it. And then in general, like some of these details of like, say this one here and this one here, they're kind of pinching the edges of stuff. And I think unless it's like a Boolean or something where it's like, this is sort of, if I kind of just draw this out here, like you've got your edge that's kind of like this, of like, here's the bevel and here's like the top surface, that unless you're doing something like this, where it's like, there's like a screw cutout or something sort of in that surface, that if you were to just have something like kind of go up to the edge like this. Now with that in mind, so these could work if we just kind of come in here and kind of just like straighten it out. So it feels more like it's a Boolean cutout versus say a detail kind of pinching the edge, because it's going to feel very awkward otherwise. And it'll make it feel like structurally unsound. So just having it sort of feed into that edge like that is going to feel much more believable. Okay, and maybe like rounding this one out here a little bit more. But this sort of like transition here is kind of nice. I do think that if you're going for this like smooth sort of effect, what you could do is also like smooth out some of these surfaces here. Oh, that is way too big. So like just hitting this with a nice sort of soft transition, so it feels like that surface is doing this. Oh, that brush doesn't work. Going more like that, as opposed to like a sharp angling out of that particular surface. And like you could use some potentially like some cut lines on this one here that could make it kind of interesting. If we look kind of back at some of these other ones here, you do get like I think Timur is the one who worked on this one here. So you get some really interesting sort of like edges being defined, like sharpness here, but also like cut lines coming in here and breaking up the forms, right? Like right here, or this sort of shape. So never be afraid to kind of introduce that kind of stuff if possible. Here. So if we were to like look at this, it could maybe be like, oh, maybe we can just kind of come in here and have like that potentially, right? And it just sort of like breaks up the shape just a little bit more and creates sort of a touch more interest potentially. The trigger could maybe sort of like fill this in. It feels a little bit odd that it's being sort of like hollowed out like that. So I just like fill it in for interest's sake. And then thinking about how this sort of sits in the form here is going to be good. Is there sort of a bit of a gap or something? Are there areas where it kind of like there's a bit of tech kind of holding it in potentially? That could be kind of nice. And avoiding it being like too even going all the way around. So like if you want the front to be like a little bit sort of like bigger here, maybe this like bevel changes so it's a bit wider there. Just stuff like that. And being careful, like don't go too crazy when it comes to these like kind of details here, because it just becomes like overwhelming. So I'd say go for like bulkier details versus ones that are kind of like way too repeating and way too just like consistent. Because you could do something called like the squint test, where if you kind of like look at this and if the details just kind of vanish, then these things aren't worth having. So you can either bulk them up or just get rid of them. So that would be my recommendation for that. But yeah, I think otherwise this is looking pretty cool. Maybe having this kind of come up here. So yeah, there you go. Finding opportunities to sort of like echo those shapes out is going to be really good. As far as like for first person sort of usability of this particular weapon, I think also being careful, like if these angles are like slightly different, I feel like that could be a bit problematic. Though I think because this one is kind of lining up with that one, that either they all line up, or if this one is kind of more like that, it should be fine. But that's a matter of preference maybe. So for first person, I would say like this one's pretty interesting. There's a lot of potential opportunity for like maybe there's a screen here or some sort of like maybe it's like cut in, like it's kind of shaped like this, and there's some details in here or something. So I could see there being some like really interesting stuff happening there potentially. There's a lot of opportunity to play with this one. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So for this one here, let me just check my notes. So this was pretty cool. I really like the sort of like the layering effect you've got going on here with like this form here and the underform and even this back one. But mostly this idea of it's a very clear like top, and then this you're using sort of different shapes and detail and breakup for like the underforms, like this one here, which is really cool. And it makes it a very clear difference between like what's the outer shell, and it's clearly protecting this more fragile underform here, which is pretty cool. And I think this will actually also be like a really neat sort of addition for the first person. So I think this is a pretty cool call for doing this. That's pretty neat. Otherwise, let me just kind of like go through some of the other stuff here. So I think like maybe some of these shapes might feel a little bit kind of flat potentially, where they just kind of like, if I kind of extrude this out, it will look like this maybe if it's rounded, and then just kind of go straight down. And that's like not super interesting. So I think either this could like maybe kind of see here, if we trimmed this and it kind of goes inside this form, that could be kind of interesting maybe. So like you get it kind of happening like this. That could be neat. That's an opportunity. Another one that could be done here, because like also this sort of terminates in a really kind of awkward way where it kind of what's happening? Where it kind of comes down here and pokes out too far. If it kind of like lined up like nicely with this, that would feel good. Or even if it went beyond it and then kind of echoed this sort of form, that would be good. But it feels like a little bit like it's poking awkwardly out a touch there. And this is doing the same kind of thing a little bit awkwardly, where it kind of pokes up and it's not mimicking or working nicely with this sort of shape you've got going on in the back here. So it could be maybe like coming up and then a sort of a flat area echoes out that form. And then you could have it like scoop in or something, or kind of flow back. And that might feel a little bit more interesting for that. But so going back to this shape here, potentially this could even like come down to sort of play up that idea or make it relate more to like what's happening back here. Of maybe it sort of comes down here and swoops in front of the gun. There's a bit of an air gap there potentially. Something like that. That could be really neat. Maybe. I don't know. To me it is. Yeah. I think maybe like these shapes here feel a little bit like they're coming out of nowhere, and finding a way to sort of integrate them might be a little bit nicer. Whether they appear like elsewhere in other areas that may be like manipulatable, potentially like up here if like you were to pull this like piece back or something, but just so they just don't appear in like one spot, and in a very sort of like if they were connected to these potentially as a grip element, that could be maybe neat. And I think it's generally going to be just like trying to find ways on this particular one to make these forms feel more dimensional and less just like straight down flat. This one kind of curves in a bit, feels like, but it still overall feels like quite flat kind of coming down here. So maybe there's like if we kind of go back to some of this reference here, that there's these interesting sort of almost like almond or not pill shapes, but this, if we kind of like look at this in kind of if I bend it in 3D space a little, you get this sort of like shape like this, right? And that's very kind of very interesting. So if there's an opportunity for you to kind of play with that idea, or that sort of this shape here where it kind of cuts in, I think that could be really quite nice on this. So even for say here, and it's echoing the forms, right? So maybe it kind of comes up and then down. So you might have to adjust the form of this. Maybe it kind of like flattens out here a little bit at the bottom. Yeah, I might have to adjust the shape of this. Or something like this maybe. And maybe this rounds out in a nice sort of organic way. Yeah, something like this maybe. And we'll grab that sort of shadow to make it obvious that this sort of is overlapping. And then a white showing this kind of cutting in. If we kind of zoom out, I mean, like I'm doing it pretty rough here, but you can kind of see it sort of breaks it up in an interesting way there. And obviously you're going to have to play with the shapes a little bit more just to make it a little bit tighter. But definitely that idea of kind of creating some more surface variation or surface contrast is going to be really nice. And that'll go down to even just like some of these edges here, having them be a little bit more varied as far as how they're flowing down the length of something. Like going back to this, that you get this like wide, go to red here, wide to medium to thin. And so bringing that sort of variation is really going to help make this interesting. So even like for these here, right, like bringing back some of these shapes here and kind of flowing them through the design is really going to kind of potentially create some interesting shapes you can play with here. And of course, like cut lines and stuff like that will also help with this as well. Yeah, and I think that's about it for number 2. Okay, number 3. So this one here is like nice breakup of masses. I really actually like the fact that there's like not a lot happening here. That's pretty cool. It has a bit of a sort of a retro vibe. Has like a bit of like almost like a ray gun kind of feel, like that kind of like old school kind of retro ray gun feel. Has a touch of that, which is fine. I don't so much mind it. I think maybe this form here also, actually I think this is cool that you have this included, the hammer. Like I said, that this is sort of like an important element that should be included. It doesn't necessarily have to have a function as you get further up, but definitely sort of a recognizable feature that when you see this, you want to be like, oh, this is definitely a classic or a handgun. At least if we're referring this to being like kind of like Valorant. So next up, I'm going to kind of like talk a little bit about this here. I think that like I was saying on the previous one, that it could be kind of cool if this was more of an inset or was going inside the gun. So if we kind of trace out the front form of this, that it would be more like goes in and then flat, or then like it's bubbled out, or it's like a further cut in there, and then kind of comes back out. Like that could be kind of neat, I think. Having it be more, just go back, it's kind of like this, and then bevel, feels a little bit strange. So I'd see, like, think more about how you could carve in the shapes to make like the form interesting, and potentially there's an opportunity for you to like work in some of these shapes going from the front maybe. That could be kind of nice. Just to like potentially not like break up this big mass here, but bring some more sort of flow interest to it. Like, you don't need to have like these details and that kind of stuff in there. As far as like this detail in here, it feels a little bit strange. It's like you've got some like 2.5D, it's like trying to be like in perspective, but it's not. So I think for like side views, don't pretend like there's like some sort of perspective happening. Just make it straight. Unless like this form is, if we're on like from a top view here, unless it's like physically kind of coming out in space, if this is like the shape of the gun is like poking out at that angle, then it makes sense. Otherwise, I would just keep this like that straight, and that'll be a lot like cleaner way of approaching that. And I'd probably like reduce some of the details in there too, because it's getting a little bit high frequency for in here compared to the rest of the gun. Otherwise, maybe the angle of this could be adjusted a little bit, because I feel like compared to sort of the base pistol and things like that, angles of handles are things that like they stay pretty consistent, and you don't typically change those. So you're doing it good on these other ones. They stay pretty much like this is the sort of typical angle of the handgun. While this one is like we'll take some animation adjustments, and would likely you would avoid that. I do like this. This is pretty cool. It's a sort of a neat addition. I do feel like this is the type of thing that if you were to kind of put your mouse, if you were to put your hand on this, like here's your hand, that it would actually pinch your fingers potentially, because it kind of goes out so much. So I would maybe like, if this is going to be a thing, that you could have it sort of come down the length so the whole hand can grab onto it potentially, or just shorten it so it kind of goes there is another option. For details, I'd be cognizant, so like same kind of thing, like careful about having too many high frequency details. For some of these like insets, I'd be careful of them feeling too much like they're sort of just like a 3D sort of inset. Like when if you're in, I don't know, like when you're in Blender or whatever, and you select a surface, and if you like do a perfect inset, it just like creates a frame. And I would say probably, or even 3D in general, I guess. I would say like try to avoid that sort of creating the perfect frame for these things. If there's ways to sort of create offsets where there's like kind of like what you're doing here, is like there's a bigger gap here versus the gaps that are in between or to the edges and such. But if it becomes like too consistent where it's like just kind of framing the edges perfectly, it can get a little bit boring. So always try to sort of spice that stuff up if possible. And once again, for some of these, if we kind of zoom right in here, these are getting a little bit too close to the edge, so always give sort of bolts and that kind of stuff a little bit of breathing room, just to be a little bit more structurally sound. And yeah, be careful of stuff like this where there's potentially too many stuff like if you kind of transition like that would be better versus having too many or changing angles, right? Like it just turns into like a little bit high frequency stuff there. Okay, and then for this kind of like, always finding ways to bring straights, have your curves kind of have an angle in there potentially. So kind of like what you're doing here, like curve, straight, curve, and then straight, and then curve. So you want to avoid this sort of feeling that for this gun, actually, this is something I forgot to mention about this gun, is that it's very curvy and there isn't a lot of straights in here. So that's definitely something you want to consider kind of bringing in here if possible. It's just a few, a little couple of straight lines where they start off straight and then they transition out, because it's going to make the gun just feel more solid in general and more just like a more mechanical rather than like an artifact or something that's like living or something. It'll add that sort of manufacturing quality to it. Okay, now for the fourth one here, this is also looking pretty neat. I actually like this one quite a bit. I think there's a lot of opportunity with this one. I feel like what you're doing in the handle for the marks, this feels like it's like much better integrated than what was happening over here, where it feels a little bit kind of tacked on. So I think like this feels very like, and the reason that is that like there's other shapes in here that are kind of echoing this form. And so it feels much more natural and just like a part of the design. So these are working really nicely. I think like the shapes you kind of got going on here, this is pretty cool. I really like this sort of strange coming out part back there. I think what's happening here could be a little bit more clarified. Just because it feels like for some of these shapes, like say this the pill shape you've got sticking out here, feels like it's kind of randomly cut. And if we sort of trace some of these other forms here, you're getting this sort of almost like swelling, pinching kind of form thing happening. So really being considerate about how you're kind of breaking up these shapes. You can have these kind of cut-ins, that's cool, but it's best to sort of think about how they're going to, is there going to be like a straight kind of cut in like that or something, or like what is the function of this? Is this going to like move around? Is it going to like, is it removable, or like what's the deal with it? So have this, you can have that in there, but definitely sort of try to bring some more like straights in there and sort of angles that sort of work with each other, as opposed to kind of creating this sort of form like this. Like it's gonna feel too organic and maybe like an intestine or something. So you'll notice like right away as I bring in these straight lines that it is sort of feeling more strong and rigid, which is exactly kind of what we're wanting to do here. You could even have this kind of pop down a bit, or even a bit more. There we go. And be careful of like some of these organic shapes in here. Like that feels like, it's great that this thing has emissives. I like that quite a bit. But these just feel kind of a bit too random in their placement. Well, this one is like, it's clear that this is there's a light source coming from this tube. And yeah, it just feels like I can see the narrative and the story behind that, versus these that just feel kind of like randomly placed, like some organic sort of lights. So if it doesn't feel like that there's a good sort of reason for them to be there, I'd say just like remove them. You're doing some good like thick, let me go back to some color, like wide or varying bevels where like this is like quite wide and long versus sort of like shorter. That's cool to see. I would continue that down the length of this. So you go wide again and then shorter. Maybe this is a bit more sort of exposed here. So you still get that valley exposed, but yeah. Okay. And then maybe for like this shape here, I'm noticing like for a lot of these guns that there's a consistency as far as like how, especially over here, how some of these shapes are the top forms. I'm assuming it's curved or even if it's flat, how they're sort of like being split up. They're quite even. So I would think about sort of adding a bit of variety to that and say, thinking about how these shapes are going to like say curve in space. So if this whole top is round, and if we just take this and kind of give this wrong direction. Give this sort of a bit of an airbrushy kind of, like it's kind of a soft edge there. It'll feel a bit more round. Oh, it's 100% white. Yeah, you definitely want to avoid 100% white if possible, because it's really going to blow out these images. But you can kind of see, right, that if I kind of connect this down, it's going to feel a lot more sleek and have that organic feel with these sort of cutouts and crispy cutouts kind of going into this form, right? So even if I throw like a little, and Timur here he'll actually throw like lines to sort of like separate these things, that they're not necessarily like this line here. This isn't like a cut line like the way this thing is. You can see it's like there's a difference in sort of darkness there, but it's like it's a little bit lighter gray or a lighter black, sorry. And he's defining that sort of that change in surface as it goes like this, right? It's not a cut line, but it's an edged plane transition. So you could actually kind of come in here like I'm doing here and just sort of like lightly kind of come in and crisp these guys up just a touch. I'm doing kind of chicken scratchy lines here, but I assume you'll get the idea. So like that, right? So you'll notice like if I kind of turn this on and off, that feels so much like crispier, right? And you can even kind of go to the back here, kind of bring this down a touch. Maybe even like a bit of an edge highlight here to show that this is like a form coming out. There we go. Same with this. Okay. Cool. And of course, airbrush this out just a touch. And you're going to get that sort of more of a rounded form, right? And it's going to feel a lot more sort of natural as far as like how it kind of transitions here. And you can have this combination of sort of rounded shapes and hard edge shapes, or how they sort of transition. So some forms will kind of like roll like this, others will kind of roll and then pinch and kind of like they'll have that angle. So you can have that sort of contrast and play throughout a design. That's perfectly fine. Let's see here. So just kind of trying to give a little bit more form to this with a maybe there's a hard edge here that I'm just kind of representing with the harshness of the shadow as it kind of rolls from front to back. And then as it kind of comes out the bottom here, you get a softer edge. All right, cool. So let's just turn that on and off. You can take a look, see what I'm doing here. All right, yeah, these sort of sharp angles may not work as well up here either. So I think that, like, this up top here might be a little bit too organic potentially compared to the rest of the gun, especially like the blue shape just feels kind of, it's similar to sort of like what was going on in there earlier with those shapes. So I think giving it a little bit more form might be good. Same thing with some of these shapes here. Just give it a shape that's like feels more manufactured and less sort of a mushy like tarp like feel. And you can see like right away that's starting to feel a little bit better. And maybe even like, let's just kind of make this a sharp angle going all the way up like that. There we go. That feels a little bit better. And maybe like at the front here, definitely try to avoid these like V shapes if possible, like this. I would probably first of all, I would actually open up this whole area here because it's like, I think having like more of a contrast of like dark and like white covering, protective shell, and more of an exposed area is going to be quite nice. So you could even sort of have it be flat and then angle down here, something like that maybe. And then over here, I think there's another opportunity to potentially kind of like have something here where it kind of feeds in. That could be kind of neat maybe if you wanted to. Maybe even pull this back a touch more. Yeah, that could be kind of cool. And then you're exposing this front area a little bit more, maybe even kind of like trimming this back a bit. Right? Maybe this kind of comes out a little. So it's kind of revealing that area of the gun. There we go. So something like that, maybe. Yeah, that's maybe how good. Yeah, I think overall this is looking pretty good though. I think like maybe in here you could like reduce some of the detail, because this is gonna be like, if you have high frequency detail in some of these areas, it's like that aren't gonna be seen. Like this sort of wraps under the gun, so it'd be appearing like right there. You're not gonna really see this very much, so I would probably like opt to simplify some of these things here if you're not gonna see them. And you don't really see those sort of like those cut shapes like that anywhere else in the gun, so it might be better just to potentially remove them, I think. And I'd also this one's getting a little bit angled as well too. Actually, I think like especially with the trigger guard you've got going on here, and even the trigger itself, I think like having an obvious trigger is always like really nice. But this trigger guard, I feel like it's going to interfere with a person's grip on this. So same kind of thing of like where I kind of just like sketched in a gross hand here to sort of show how someone's going to grab onto this thing. That all of a sudden you'll be like, oh god, my middle finger is going to be like getting poked by this thing, or it's going to be like split really awkwardly and then pinched with the other two. So really kind of consider that when you're doing these designs. Otherwise, yeah, I think these are pretty successful. Yeah, good work on these. Really nice to see the different kinds of explorations that people are kind of doing with these. But yeah, I hope that was helpful. And yeah. And whoever, oh yeah, I guess we could have been looking at this stuff here more. Actually, let's just jump back to this real quick and kind of go over this. Yeah, so yeah, you can totally see from some of these that he was pulling, that were being pulled from here, that we have like some of these like cool sort of shapes. You can definitely see sort of getting repeated in some of these forms that are reappearing. Some bike gears, bike brakes, these flow shapes. We definitely saw these in like number 2. The different sort of like layering effects of like dark covering versus under sort of like tech stuff, or just contrasted materials. And the fish, which is always kind of good to sort of like, yeah, we're going for organic sort of flowing shapes here, but it's going to have to be like a fusion of these things. So it feels alive, references living things, but doesn't feel overly doesn't feel like a fish. Doesn't feel too much like that. Or doesn't feel like, typical kind of like squarish kind of guns. So it's a bit of a challenge definitely to sort of fuse these two things together. But yeah, so like I said, I hope that was kind of useful. And yeah, I think this is good work, Gino. Hope that was somewhat helpful. And yeah, hope anyone else who's watching this learned something or two. Yeah, so yeah, I'll see you guys maybe in the next one or in another tutorial maybe. Have a good one. Bye.